much. And who can resist a webinar on decentralization? So I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I am, let's see if I can get can you see my presentation now? Yes, okay.
Yes, we
I
can
think,
see it. Yes.
oh,
Yeah.
very good. Thank you. So I'm glad to be here today and or this morning to make this presentation. And this is about decentralization and democracy. And first I'll talk about decentralization, just in general what I'm referring to here, and then I'll connect this with I'll describe regime development in South Asia. And then I try to put these two things together to say something about what we can expect in the near future about the effects of decentralization in certain areas, but maybe most particularly on democracy, but we can discuss economic growth as well to some extent, I suppose. I'll be relying on a lot of my own experience and research here. To the left, you see a book which I wrote a number of years ago on decentralization, corruption, social capital, and this focused on India and the Panchayati Raj reforms in India. And these are the reforms that were carried out in India in the 1990s, which can be described as the world's largest decentralization reform. So that was a very interesting case. And then I am editing this book on autocratization in South Asia, which will be out in November most likely. And then you can download this book as it will be published as open access immediately. So and this is a book which has 30 chapters on covering mainly India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. Oh, so this is a source you can use afterwards. Okay, so let's first look at decentralization. We begin here with some very basics, right? Because decentralization is something which has been something to be decided since humans organize themselves in larger collectives. And the dilemma here is that as soon as you have an organization or a community which grows, you have to give up power. And this is something which usually rulers do not do willingly, but you have to do it as soon as something grows over a certain size and so on. You have to delegate, you have to do something at least. And this almost immediately then connects with what we mean here, more particularly with decentralization. And in my book, I use a lot of the work from Maynard, Crook, and Rondinelli here. But they use different words here because it depends a little bit on what you study, right? For a while there, devolution was the key word, and the concentration has been used quite widely as well here. So I'll explain just very quickly here how you can break this down from my perspective, at least, carrying out a study where I try to focus on whether decentralization could provide for clean governance in some way. Okay. First of all, you can talk about the geographical location of institutions, right? This is what we mean when we talk about deconcentration. You can relocate offices and just put them in other places. This is that's deconcentration. It may be a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for decentralization to take place. Because this is more important than the kind of legal status and areas of responsibility that you give to institutions, and then providing powers from that can be, that can range from responsibilities and autonomy, and you can mix in privatization here. And I'll just show this in a second, what can be, how you can look at this in a more schematic way. But what do we expect? I like the fact that you said in the beginning here that decentralization is not a goal in itself. That is pretty good. But these are certain things, at least, that we expect from decentralization. We may have economic values that we want to promote. We may have democratic values. The thing is here, which makes this thing so interesting to study, decentralization, is that these things, economic and democratic values, if you want to promote them, they may often clash. They may actually provide to be counterparts, counterweights in some way in development. So if you want to promote democratic values, it's very hard to keep up the economic values maybe, and vice versa. And the schematics I told you about recently here is this one. If you talk about decentralization then from these, with these components that I mentioned before, you can study the public administration, but you can also study the legislators and the elected organs within the state with elected representatives, and they can, work as parallel structures to some extent, right? And when you do decentralize according to these things that I mentioned before, you can have a center, and you can have the provinces and local government and so on, and then you can move power further down from within the public administration, and you can also give more power to local elected officials and the organs at the local level, right? You can also move around between the two spheres as well, and these things are important to keep track of, because you may say that you're giving more power to the people when you're moving here in this direction, but if you move towards public administration or, for example, courts and so on, maybe it's not something that works for democratic decentralization necessarily. So that's something I think is good to keep in mind when you try to evaluate the effects of decentralization and what's happening there. In my case, I done studies on corruption and decentralization in India and the Panchayati Raj reforms, and what this has done in the context of education and health in two states, Madhya Pradesh and Kerala. So we did a case study, we did studies there with surveys at the village level. And the things that we came up with here was that in this context, when we tried to study where decentralization would be effective and so on, we could see that there was an interaction effect with social capital and high levels of bridging social capital, which we also speak very fondly about in development context, right? That was to some extent related to low levels of corruption or better governance. High levels of bonding social capital was clearly related to low level of corruption. So this was an unexpected result we had from the study. What was a little bit difficult to handle for me as a researcher was that I was, of course, looking at more profound effects from decentralization on clean governance. However, though, what came out here was that we couldn't find a very clear connection, a positive direct connection from decentralization to clean government. There is a connection, we found this, there was a connection between decentralization and trust. And trust can also provide for clean government, yes. But there were other factors at work here which we couldn't actually we couldn't really figure out exactly what it was, but there were certain things that happened when you carried out decentralization, which had effects on other parts of society or government that could also counteract clean government. And here, at least, I'm discussing this in my book, and I provide some support for arguments saying that decentralization actually is something that, yes, you bring government closer to the people, but you also bring it closer to local forces of power, and that can, in certain contexts, also just give more power to those that are perhaps corrupt or trying to pursue government policies by clientelistic means or something like that. On the question on if decentralization can provide clean governance, in this study we could not find a clear effect, direct connection at least. Bonding social capital was an important role here for development. In a maybe passive way, it could provide something like a bulwark, working very good for society and local resistance against corrupt officials, things like that. And also we found also that some kind of trust was necessary, but not a sufficient condition for clean governance. Interestingly, found that there is not necessarily zero-sum relationship between bonding and bridging social capital. So this is a common way of saying that we want bridging, but bonding is just associated with mafia techniques and so on. That is not necessarily true. You have to dig deeper into this to sort out what kind of relations we're dealing with and who has this particular kind of capital as well. And finally, then the slightly anticlimactic result here was that we can't expect too much from in terms of change from below. To attack corruption, even if you have decentralization reforms, it's very hard for civil society and local actors to actually change things from the bottom up. You need support from above in some way. And this is important when you discuss the effects on economic and democratic values. So decentralization, yeah, can be good for the economy and for democracy, absolutely. But this is in a setting where you find democratic ambitions. This is the conditions within, for my study and also for many other studies, I think. And this brings us to part 2 here, which is regime development in South Asia right now. So we'll very quickly describe how the world is changing, right? If you follow the work within Varieties of Democracy project, which I'm helping out a little bit with, you can see that the share of world population living in autocracies is increasing, unfortunately, rapidly, where if you go to the Freedom House studies, we are in the 15th consecutive year of a decline of democracy in the world. And if you take this little graph to the left, when we look at the autocratizing countries versus democratizing countries, we have the democratizing countries in the blue one, and autocratizing countries in the red line. And of course, you can see here, this is when the wall came down, of course, that you would have a great increase, of course, after the wall came down in democratizing countries and so on. And very few countries were autocratizing. Now you can see here there is an increase and the lines have crossed recently. And this is when you look at the number of countries and put this into the whole presentation. If you, on the other hand, take the same graph and look at the effect here and what kind of development we're seeing when you weigh in the population, the situation looks like this, that you have a very rapid increase here in, if you look at the share of population in the world, the number of people living here in autocratizing countries, then the red line rises very sharply, and that is of course because you have a autocratization in a number of countries with large populations like India and Brazil. So this is where what Freedom House describes the situation like here. And this is, you are familiar with this picture, of course, where the green countries are the free countries, and the middle, the ones in between are the yellow ones, and the lilac ones are the ones that are autocratic. This is the situation we have now. And a few years back, Freedom House calculated that the share of the population in the world where you would have free media, like the media we can experience in Sweden, for example, was 13%. Now we move towards South Asia, and this is a graph which is terrible to look at, but it's an important one here. It describes, by using the electoral democracy index, the kind of development we've seen in South Asia for a long time here, since the 1950s. And Afghanistan is actually here. And if for next year, it will probably be down somewhere in this region again, unfortunately, very sadly. But you can also see that there are other developments here, or trends going down, unfortunately, very recently. And we sort this out a little bit by only looking at Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, which is the focus of the book on autocratization I mentioned in the beginning here. And you can see that in general, there is a downward turn, even for Sri Lanka also here in the lilac graph here part. So you had a big downturn of democracy here, and this is, of course, look, the trajectories here is they're very interesting because India was performing about the same way as Sri Lanka did for a long time. And then you saw a gradual decline in Sri Lanka. And with India, there was a rapid decline. This is with the emergency then. But India came back. India showed resilience, right? And therefore, India was managing to keep the whole average for South Asia up above the 0.5 line for a very long time here for the whole region. If you look at the averages, at least, while the rest of the other countries here were struggling, to say the least, right? The thing is, what has happened here then? That is that there is a decline. Then it sets in actually in around 2012, but then it starts, then you see a rapid decline from 2014 after the Modi's regime coming into the picture here. So India is experiencing a decline in democracy, and it will soon reach the low levels of the emergency if it keeps on, if it stays on this track. So you have two big dips here, and we are in the second dip right now, and this is explained by the changing political climate, and the political map of India is changing rapidly. This is in 1984. You can see the Indian National Congress represented in the light blue here. And then you have changes. You see the BJP is growing, and the dominance that the Congress party used to have now has been absolutely completely replaced by the BJP now. So the Congress party is playing a very minor role in Indian politics in terms of power in the country. And these are the graphs representing the percentage of votes for the Congress party and BJP. You can see here that things were, it looked for a long time like these two parties were stabilizing on similar paths, but then you had a big break here in 2009 to between 2009 to 2014, and this has to do with governance to a large extent. If you look at the political agendas that first took BJP to power, it was very much about corruption and such issues. So even though the reforms of decentralization were carried out here in the 1990s, it didn't help the Congress very much because they lost power, and then the BJP makes this jump up here. So they're dominating politics now in most ways in India. We can bring in the graphs for Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Bangladesh with India here to look at the Freedom of Expression Index. Here you see downward trends for all the countries, including Sri Lanka, unfortunately. Freedom of academic and cultural expression, the same kind of pattern is repeated here. And when it comes to civil society repression, the downward trend is marked very, very clearly here in all countries. And this, it seems that studying development in these countries, you can see CSO repression comes first, and then the media after that, and then institutions. It's that order if you want to see. If you can try to see what comes in what order with the autocratization, it looks like that. So in the context of a larger context, we have a new world order as well. The Asian century has already begun, where the production of the economies in Asia has become bigger than the rest of the world. And you can describe this as a situation returning to normality, actually, because this is what has been usually historically for a long time, that Asia's combined economies have always been greater than the rest of the world. And this is the decline, which is connected with the fact of rapid industrialization in the West, but also rapid suppression of rights in China. but here now it's changing, and Asia is economically larger probably than the rest of the world. The worrying trend here is that Xi Jinping is actually starting to pursue policies that are related to that are similar to those of Chairman Mao. And this is a worrying trend, of course, for the prospects of democracy and the context of reforms in a democratic setting for this part of the world, of course. What finally then is to be expected in the near future? Well, if you look at this part here, if we look at reforms which can be aimed at decentralization and so on, you will have very little effect of this in a democratic way, of course. So this is something which will be taken out of the equation if you speak about decentralization in this part of the world. At least you can have, of course, elected representatives within an authoritarian setting, but at least within a democratic setting, we are losing this part, I think, if we are interested in what effects democracy, decentralization can have. World Bank always often speaks about knowledge economies, how they work, right? This is actually a way of displaying development, and in my opinion, it's just a new version of modernization theory, which is not bad in itself. I think that there is a there's a causal chain here, which is important, where you go from knowledge, where you build networks of exchange, where you get more material resources, and that can lead then to emancipative values in some way, right? That can also work in the other direction, then, that you have, if you have freedom, then you can also have a kind of development where your knowledge increase also if you have a fairly free society. Now this, if you take that away and don't allow for this arrow here is going to be quite weak, I think. Furthermore, exit and voice, that is an important concept in trying to understand the prospects here for this part of the world. And I connect to Albert Hirschman's work, and that is that a society has the power to correct itself if the people has the possibility to exit in some way. In politics, that is, that we switch party if we don't like the one which is in power right now, or voice, that you can make your voice heard within the parties by elections and so on. And if you take away one of them or both, you will very easily get political instability in some way. And this is what we can then expect in the current situation, I think. That is that decentralization in itself cannot be expected to fix democracy in these contexts just described, because these are such strong forces. So we can it's very hard to have that kind of expectation on the decentralization. It can actually lead to the opposite instead. Same thing goes for corruption, actually. And if you have economic slowdown, you will most likely get political instability. And this is, of course, something that can happen in democracies as well, as you know. But the thing is here that we talk about input and output when we talk about what makes a regime legitimate in the minds of the people, right? And input is the part where we go to vote and we can form parties and such things. And but the thing that is important for legitimacy. But output is also very, very important, even more important in countries, especially where poverty is widespread. But so an output is, infrastructure, the capacity of the state to build the roads, to provide hospitals, schools, etc. Now, so a lot of times people may think output is more important than input. That is something we know from research, right? But there is an advantage for democracies, and that is that when you have an economic slowdown or of some kind, you may not get as much output, but people's frustrations and discontent can be channeled by input, and that provides more stability. Not in all cases, but in many times it does. So that is an advantage to have both those things in system. And here, if you do have both of them, decentralization can play a role, which is positive as well. Thank you very much.